And welcome back to Fishing College. Today, we're going to be diving into, is braid the right line for you? And this is something that a lot of you have been asking a lot of questions about in the past couple of days. Is braid right for me? What pound braid should I be using? Why do bass fishermen use such giant braid? And why am I not catching fish with clear water when I'm using 45-pound braid? Remember to go ahead and like and subscribe, and let's jump right into it. So topics that we're going to cover in this video. We're going to go with the pros. We're going to go with the kind of like things about braid that may or may not be a pro or con. It just kind of depends on the application. And then the actual cons, as well as a couple of extra tidbits about braid that are pretty interesting. What braided fishing line is that they are tightly woven braided fibers that are aligned into an actual strand. For example, it's very, very similar to like a rope or a fibrous-like structure. So it's gonna almost kind of feel like very, very thin rope. It's very, very hard to cut, and in general, it's gonna be really durable. And that's actually leading us into our first big pro, is the fact that it is by far and away one of the most just straight out, most durable type of fishing line. And that's something that's actually really important whenever you are picking a fishing line, is talking about the major pros and how durable it actually is under certain conditions. And in regular, normal conditions, this is by far and away the most durable fishing line. Another thing that's actually really important to kind of realize about braid is that it is typically a smaller diameter. So, for example, 10-pound mono is going to be the equivalent of about 50-pound braid. So, because they are equivalent diameters, you can usually run thicker braid or even thinner braid and get a lot more casting distance out of your regular cast, which can be really important if you're trying to cover water or if you're trying to run a topwater where you're covering a lot of banks and covering a lot of areas very quickly, which can be, I guess, in a way, kind of an efficiency thing. So braid can be really efficient at casting, really efficient at covering water, comparative to other types of fishing line. One of the big things that braid is really prominently known for is that it is the most sensitive fishing line. And I am talking tens of thousands times more sensitive than monofilament, pretty consistently just way more sensitive than fluorocarbon. And so because of that sensitivity, you are going to pick up on much more subtle bites and basically be able to feel the entire bottom, everything that is going on with your lure, and everything that is going on in the water column. So that's one of the big things with braid that I guess is talked about a lot, but is still one of the most important factors, is because it is so sensitive. In the previous video, we had talked about how monofilament is really, really big on degrading in the sunlight. But when you start coming into other types of line, like braid or fluorocarbon, they do not have that issue, which is something that's actually really important, in particular for boat anglers, because they're usually going to have these rods out on their deck, ready to be picked up at a moment's notice. And if they're just sitting out there in the sun all day, unprotected, they're going to degrade, they're going to stretch more, they're going to more easily snap, things like that. And yet that can be a really big problem for a lot of tournament anglers. Because if they go and pick up a rod expecting for the line on it to be completely good, and it just outright snaps on them, that can be a really big problem. So that's something that's actually really important to know about braid, is that it's highly UV resistant and doesn't really have that problem. Next, let's get into something that's actually really important, and this is going to be kind of doubling back to the durability. Braid has decent abrasion resistance. It's not quite as good as fluorocarbon, but it's definitely a lot better than monofilament with its abrasion resistance. And what I mean about that is if you're here and you are dragging it up against rocks and whatnot and against logs, it is going to do that relatively decent, but it's not going to have any kind of, some kind of god tier abrasion resistance. What really shines with braid is its tensile strength, and aka how much actual force it takes to rip it apart end by end. So when we start talking about that, that's one of the big things that shine with braid. But if it's just going to be simply rubbing it against rocks or having any kind of contact with other objects that are in the water, that can sometimes be a little bit of a problem. because whenever braid gets a small nick in it or any kind of damage in it, it can just outright snap on you, which can be a little bit of a problem whenever you are doing, like, for example, skipping under a dock, or you are doing some deep football jigging, or you are potentially using another technique that might be very heavy. You get a couple of nicks in it, you go to cast, and your line just completely explodes and snaps, which can be a little bit of a problem because you just lost your lure. But this isn't as big of a problem as I'm making it seem. It's not like, oh, I need to avoid every single rock, I need to avoid every single blah, blah, blah. Just whenever you are in those areas, make sure that you're checking your line and make sure that you're inspecting it every once in a while to make sure that it doesn't have cuts in it, that it doesn't have any kind of fraying in it. Because once it gets frayed, it's going to compound and it's eventually just going to snap. So make sure that you're inspecting it, and if it does have that fray, cut it above that fray and just retie. And that's all it is. And that's just an every once in a while thing. You don't have to constantly check it, constantly this, that. Unless you're fishing around really sharp, razor sharp rocks, it's not going to be as much of an issue as I'm making it out to be. Now, this is a really big plus that I actually really love about braid, is the fact that it does not have any memory whatsoever. It does not conform to the spool that it's on. And this is something that I love about it. So I explained this in my monofilament video, but we're going to go about it in our braid video as well. So when I unlock this spool and I pull line off of it, it's just its own entity. It doesn't conform in any way, shape, or form to the spool that it's on. So I can just go ahead and reel in, and I can unreel, I can leave this on there as long as it needs to be, and it is not going to have any issues with memorizing the shape of this spool. So that is one gigantic plus when it comes to braid, because, well, you can leave this on there as long as it needs to be, and it's never going to be an issue. And the last big pro when it comes to braid is just the wide array of colors. Man, like, I can go into any department store, I can get braid that's gray, black, white, green, yellow, red, and it's not going to be any kind of like tall feet. No one's gonna laugh at you if you say, oh, I need some white braid, I need some gray braid, I need some green braid. No one's gonna laugh at you if you say that. Now, why you'd be using those different colors, that's for you to decide, because that is for a visibility standpoint. If you're fishing in water that is super orangish red, you might want to go with a more of a red type braid because it's going to hide in that water a little bit better. But if you're going to be fishing in clear water, we'll get to that a little bit later. Now, let's get into kind of the parts of braid, which aren't really cons, but they're not really pros either. They're just kind of things about braid. And the first thing is that it floats. And some of you are probably thinking, why are you putting that in that part of the video? Because for one simple fact, depending on what kind of technique you're using, the fact that it floats can either hurt you or it might help you. So what I commonly use braid for is a topwater frog. So the fact that this line is going to be floating and not applying any pressure, pulling that frog down, is a huge plus for me. But say I was doing a deep crankbait and I was using braid for whatever reason. That braid is going to have an upward pulling pressure on that crankbait. So it is going to slightly affect the action of that crankbait. Now, this isn't, enough to like lift a rod or anything. Absolutely not. But it is an actual force and it can affect the action of a bait. So that's just something that's important to know. Another thing that's kind of that type deal is the fact that it has absolutely zero stretch. Well, it probably has a little bit of stretch, but in terms of other fishing line, it is so close to zero that we're just going to go ahead and call it zero. And why is that important? It's important for certain techniques. If you're using treble hooks and you apply way too much pressure while you're using braid, you're just going to rip the hook straight out of that fish's mouth. But if you're using a topwater frog, which has these really thick double-pronged hooks, that can be a really big plus. Because it has zero stretch, you're able to rip that fish out of whatever cover it is much more effectively, and you are able to set the hook much more effectively on those double prong hooks. This is kind of the last thing, and that's just because it is very high visibility. Because it is so high visibility, if you are using it in clear water, it is typically recommended that you use either a monofilament or fluorocarbon leader. And I'm going to get into leaders in a different video, but all that is basically where you are going to be tying two different lines together to where you are going from that braided line tied together into that fluorocarbon or monofilament to where it either adds a little bit of stretch to that line or it adds basically kind of like a barrier between what is visible and what's not visible tied to your lure. Now let's get into some of these cons, which can be a little bit of a problem from time to time with braid. And the first big one is going to be cost, which can be a really big problem a lot of the time when people are trying to use braid. For example, monofilament, you can get about 500 yards of it for about $10. For example, with braid, depending on what brand you use, how high test it is, where you're buying it, it could be double, triple, quadruple times the cost of that. And so because of that, that can kind of sway a lot of people away from buying braid sometimes. Even though it is a super useful tool and a super useful line, it's not really something that a lot of beginner anglers might be using because, well, they're still trying to build out their tackle box. They're still trying to build out a lot of things. And spending $30, $40 on fishing line may not be very economical for them. So that is by far the biggest con for braid. Something that a lot of people don't really talk about with braid is the fact that it does apply a little bit of premature wear and tear on your reel and your actual rod. How it actually goes about doing this is the fact that it is slightly abrasive. For example, on your eyelets, on your spool, on your line guide, things like that, and that can apply a lot of force and a lot of premature breakage on the actual pieces and parts. Now, I've kind of already talked about this with kind of my parts with braid, but the fact is that it's really bad for any kind of clear water, and it's really bad for any kind of visibility that's, I guess, over 3 feet. Because of that, you want to be using what's called a leader. And I'm not gonna like double back and repeat all the same information for this part of the video, but you get the idea. That's a really big con for braid because you have to add extra line to where you're able to fish it down through the actual water column in clear water. That can be a really big problem for some people. And last but not least, with the cons at least for the ones that are most notable, braid does absorb water. It does hold water. And this isn't something that's going to be too crazy. It's not really something that, you know, you need to be taking like too crazy note of, but it does hold water and it will absorb it over time. So just kind of taking note of that and understanding why it's going to start sinking a little bit over time if you're fishing for a long period of time with that braid is just something to kind of understand about it. It's not really something that you should be constantly worried about, oh, I need to like wring out my braid or anything like that. No. That's not something you have to do. It's just something that I more or less am just kind of making you aware of. Let's get into probably my favorite argument for all of eternity. And that is, why do bass fishermen use such gigantic braid? And I'm talking, you know, if you talk to any saltwater fisherman, they are going to have like this weird thorn in their side about it. And they're going to be really petty about it. You know, why do bass fishermen have to use 65-pound braid? I fish for tarpon with that. I fish for blue marlin with that. I pull in some sharks with that, like some small sharks. And there's an actual reason why we do use such thick braid. First big thing is the fact that we are fishing around a lot more structure, a lot more really thick, dingy, algae type grass. We are fishing around a lot of areas where that fish can grab our lure and go under like a bunch of rocks, potentially break us off. We're fishing around a lot more docks, things like that, where we need to utilize that no stretch and that higher pound test to where that fish doesn't break us off very easily. Another big reason is line size diameter equivalency. And you probably heard me mention this earlier in the video, the fact that 10-pound mono and 50-pound braid are about the same size. But let's put this into a little bit more terms that you guys might understand. The fact that 10-pound braid is equal to about 2-pound mono. And honestly, the further that you go up this tree, it does get a good bit thicker. It does get at least a little bit closer to those higher actual size diameters. For example, if you go to 80-pound braid, it's closer to more like 18-pound mono, which 18-pound mono, yeah, we're probably not going to be using that whenever we're using mono, unless we're going to be throwing larger swim baits. But whenever you're spooling up any kind of reel, you don't want to be putting on about 600 yards of 2-pound mono. For one, that's just not economical, and also the fact that that's way too much line that can end up causing issues for your reel. Not to mention, certain reels and certain rods are also designed to work with specific line diameters and also specific line pound tests to where they can function properly. For example, this reel is a 9.1 to 1 gear ratio, and it is a Casking Mega Jaws. If I remember correctly, it is designed to be working with line that is anywhere between around 10 all the way up to 18-pound mono. And if you look at diameter equivalencies, that is going to lead you to about 50-pound braid all the way up to 70-pound braid. So because this is a topwater flipping and pitching reel, that is what it is specifically designed for, to where it is working properly. For example, if I used line that was way too small, it's not going to be working properly, it may not feed properly, it may not work properly with the gear ratio, and it might have times where the line is not able to bite into itself to give you that proper amount of torque. And last but not least, you guys probably remember me saying we're going to be fishing around of gunk and stuff like that. We have a technique that's called punching, where you're going to take a big, thick, heavy weight and a large, soft plastic, and you are going to punch through a bunch of matted vegetation to where you can go down into the actual grass and the water column that is below it. And that is typically where fish are going to be. Whenever you are punching, it's recommended that you go 65 to 85-pound braid. And gosh, open water, that's way overkill. I agree, it's way overkill. But if you're going to be pulling in about 20 pounds of weeds and maybe only about 3 pounds worth of fish, do you understand the problem here? That is a lot of weeds for not all that much fish. And that is a very common problem whenever you're punching, or if you're ever fishing a topwater frog. I've had plenty of instances where I've had a bunch of weeds that I've had to pull in with the mouth of the bass, and that can be kind of a problem. Another thing is that thicker braid is also going to have a much easier time cutting through those weeds and cutting through that grass than thinner braid. It's not going to break as often, it's going to have much more ability to pull against it without snapping, and you're just going to have a much easier time using it. So now that we've kind of tallied up everything in terms of pros, cons, and also line diameters, that is giving you the information that you need to be able to understand if braided fishing line is right for you. What I'm typically going to be using braided fishing line for is punching, topwater frogs, topwater walking baits, basically a lot of topwaters. If I'm going to be using braid and it's very clear water, I'm going to be using a fluorocarbon leader. If it's going to be any kind of deeper technique or anything like that, I'm always going to be using a leader. Use braided fishing line for stuff like a wacky rig, a Texas rig, skipping jigs, deep football jigging, stuff like that. Stuff where I have a very thick gauge hook that I need to drive through that fish's mouth. That is mostly where I'm going to be using braid. In a way, here's a really good guide. If it's a topwater, maybe consider using braid. If it has a really thick gauge hook, maybe consider using braid. But if it has a treble hook, if it's something that goes really deep in the water and has action that keeps it deep in the water, maybe consider using fluorocarbon or monofilament, or at least using a leader. I hope this helps, and as per usual, have fun catching fish, people. Peace.